Okay, so just to review here, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of using foot patrol and policing. So, what we figured out from the Kelling experiment in New York, New Jersey, is the fact that foot patrol does seem like it reduces people's fear and avoidance of public space. Even though it doesn't have fantastic crime returns in terms of reducing crime, it enables people over time slowly to use their communities more, to feel more confident, less fearful of spending time in their areas. And essentially, the idea is what's been suggested is that foot patrol encourages a less disorderly community. It also seems like it improves positive attitudes about policing. As you can imagine, in many neighborhoods and many communities throughout this country, there's a lot of animosity and hatred of the police, sometimes historically without, uh, not very surprising. So, another good thing that foot patrol seems to do is it encourages community members to form good relationships with their police officers, to have police officers who, are invested in and care about the people within their community, and improve relationships between citizens and law enforcement. So those are probably some pros of using foot patrol and policing, but think about what some potential cons might be about relying on foot patrol as a strategy in law enforcement. So if we were in class, I would ask you guys to discuss this. We would discuss this together. But some potential cons that have been brought up to me by students in the past. If you're a foot patrol, you can't exactly rapidly respond unless you're a heck of a good runner. A foot patrol officer can't respond very quickly to an incident that happens, 5 or 6 blocks away. At least not soon enough to hypothetically do anything about the situation. So that's one con that some people would highlight. Another con would be if you have patrol officers who are patrolling by themselves or with one other person, and a really serious situation arises. Being out of a car means the patrol officers are a little bit more at risk on a day-to-day basis. They're literally in the line of fire more for a variety of different types of situations, and they don't necessarily have the protection of a police car. Um, Another thing that people have suggested is if a police officer does happen to walk past an event where he feels the need to make an arrest, he can't exactly bring that person quickly or safely into custody without the use of a patrol car. So there are some things about it that make people think that, well, we probably shouldn't just move to this model. There are some things that we still need to keep patrol officers in cars. But what's happened since the 1980s, and really sparked by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling's theory, which we'll talk about next, is this idea that police should be invested in, focused on, and experts in their community. And they should primarily be seeking to prevent crime by forming community attachments and partnerships. So, kind of making community members co owners of the problem of dealing with crime and other disorderly factors. But where we should start this is the fact that all of this really got kicked off in the 1980s with the article that I had you guys read from Atlantic Magazine, 1982, called Broken Windows Policing. So, just first of all, just to give you an idea of how significant and what a big splash this article made, they purposely, you'll notice, this was published in the Atlantic Magazine. It wasn't published in a scholarly journal. And they did that on purpose. They did that because they wanted this article, they wanted their theory and their ideas about policing to be read by a very large audience, not just academics, not just law enforcement experts. They wanted cops all over the country, police chiefs all over the country, the general public to read this thing and get exposed to it. Exact figures aren't really available, but the circulation staff of The Atlantic, for those of you who don't know, The Atlantic magazine is incredibly old, reputable magazine in this country, around for the better part of the 20th century. And the circulation staff of The Atlantic have told both James Q. Wilson and George Kelling that this article, this Broken Windows article, has been reproduced, downloaded, copied, etc., ordered more than any other article in their history. So this was an incredibly well-read, significant article. And at the time, the Atlantic had a huge national circulation rate and was read by politicians, by legal professionals, police administrators. So, what you should understand is what you guys had to read for class today. Not only touched kind of the policing community, but it touched people's awareness. It was on people's radar that had a chance to, you know, invoke policy changes, talk about it in legal discourse. It made an immediate impact. So why this term broken windows? Well, the analogy from their theory, which you guys have now should now at least be vaguely familiar with from the article, the analogy is this idea that if a window in a building is broken and is left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. So one unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. That's the analogy that they're basing their theory on. That small little signs of problems, if left untended, if left unresolved, are going to encourage and show people over time that this is a neighborhood that no one cares about, that it's okay to do whatever you want here because this is an unkept, disorderly place. So the theme of this theory and the theme of the article that you guys had to read is the fact that tending to disorder, not just serious crime, but tending to small level disorderly behavior is important, that it matters, and if you tend to it, you will be able to stop long-term problems in the end. That it can be as simple as making sure that all the houses on your block have windows in them and aren't boarded up and in disarray. That can encourage people not only to not commit crime, but encourage people to get out and be active members of their communities. So this idea is that disorder matters because it threatens the social order by creating fear and criminogenic conditions. The idea that vandalism and small-time disorderly offenses can occur anywhere once communal barriers get broken, once people's sense of mutual regard and obligation of civility are lowered by actions that seem to signal that no one cares. So think back to the Zimbardo car experiment. In Palo Alto, a fairly organized community, nobody touched an untouched car. It took someone to break the window and show that that car is not cared for people to go in, vandalize it, strip it for parts, the same way they had done in another community. So Wilson and Kelling liked that example because they wanted to show that in any community, run down or not, initial signs of disorder, if left untended, are problematic. So this word that we keep tossing around, disorder, what does that actually mean? What would be some examples? Think about this in your head before we go on. What would be some examples of disorderly behavior within a neighborhood? What would be some triggers, some symbols and signs to you guys if you walked down the block of a neighborhood per se that would lead you to believe that it was or was not disorderly? Well, some of the examples from Wilson and Kelling are listed here below. Things like aggressive panhandling, not just offering to sell someone something, but following them and getting in their faces and aggressively trying to sell your fare. That was an example they gave. Street prostitution, pretty simple sign of a disorderly community. Street prostitution being left unchecked is a definite sign for them. Public drinking, people with beer in brown paper bags, liquor bottles in brown paper bags, sitting on the side of the road drinking. Graffiti was another one that they talked about. Urinating in public. Unlicensed vending or peddling. This last one, unsolicited squeegeeing. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a city or been in a neighborhood where somebody comes up to your car and tries to squeegee or clean your windshield for a few dollars, but that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, really became a pillar of something that people wanted to target to combat disorder. So, I mean, think about all the things on this list. Not a lot of things on this list are especially heinous or evil or predatory. So, one of the questions that they pose is, why should these behaviors get regulated at all? And Wilson and Kelling would argue that these behaviors are critical to regulate and to deal with, because the fear that the presence of these kind of things engender in a local community and the potential for decay and more serious crime that follows is what makes these things a problem. In other words, aggressive panhandling doesn't cause crime. But over time, if you are afraid to go out into your community, if your community gets more and more run down, if more and more serious forms of disorder start to pile up and people become less and less controlling of their community, that's when crime is going to emerge. So it's kind of an indirect relationship over time. They're not saying that these things, which could all be considered public order crimes, by the way, are actually directly causing crime. What they're suggesting is these things start a chain reaction in communities that slowly break them down and lead people to believe that nobody cares about these communities, so you might as well do whatever you want in them, including crime. So let's think about this model. I know we haven't done theory models in a while, but let's actually think about this broken window model. I want to make sure that you kind of understand what we're talking about here. So according to them, what starts neighborhoods to go bad, to experience problems, is when disorderly behavior goes unchecked. Anything on that list that we talked about before, aggressive panhandling, drinking in the street, graffiti, if those things happen and you clean them up, that's a sign that people care about your community. But if those things start to happen and nobody really does anything about them, nobody really punishes or discourages or calls the cops on people over time, that's going to be a problem according to them, because it's going to promote citizen fear. Citizens aren't going to want to deal with those signs of disorder, so they're going to start to avoid their community. They're going to start to avoid public areas, stop hanging out socially, normally within their community. And that's a problem. Citizens being afraid is a problem, and citizens avoiding public spaces is a problem, because it leads to a breakdown in informal social controls and bonds. Think about it this way. If you lived in a neighborhood where you were afraid to go out ever without somebody with you, and certainly not at nighttime, where the neighbors around you left garbage out, hung out on their stoops all the time, sometimes leaving bottles around. If you live in a community like that, you're not going to want to spend a lot of time in it. And you're certainly not going to want to spend a lot of time outside in it, making the community a better place. So what people do is they retreat. If they still live there, they just kind of go from their apartment to their house and they don't spend much time outside. And there's a huge breakdown, according to Wilson and Kelling, in that community's level to control what goes on inside it. If you're not around to monitor and check things and deal with things, the community is going to become disorderly. People are going to stop forming friendships and bonds, and over time for them, there will be an influx of much more serious disorderly behavior as a result of this, and then more serious crime. So you can see that this isn't a direct relationship between disorder and more serious crime. Graffiti doesn't cause crime, but it causes a chain reaction of things that eventually, if it continues to go unchecked, could result in more serious behavior over time. So just to give you an excerpt from the article of the kind of chain reaction that they're talking about, here's an excerpt from the Broken Windows article that you had to read. A piece of property is abandoned. Weeds grow up. A window is smashed. Adults stop scolding rowdy children. The children, emboldened, become more rowdy. Families move out. Unattached adults move in. Teenagers gather in front of the corner store. The merchant asks them to leave. They refuse. Fights occur. Litter accumulates. People start drinking in front of the grocery store. In time, an inebriate slumps to the sidewalk and is allowed to sleep it off. Pedestrians are approached by panhandlers. So it keeps going on like that. And they're trying to show there that this is a baby step kind of chain level reaction that can occur in communities, where these low level public order type of disorderly behaviors over time can eventually become more and more serious until you find yourself in a community with high levels of crime. So this idea that Wilson and Kelling wrote about sparked a lot of interest in the 1980s. Remember, this is a time period when people wanted there to be a change in how police were policing. And here's Wilson and Kelling talking about disorder and how if you just tend to the small things, you can not only do something about citizens' fear, but in the long run, you can do something about crime. So research on broken windows started out by trying to answer these two basic hypotheses. Is there a disorder and fear link? In other words, if you tend to disorder in a community, are citizens going to report being less afraid? For the most part, this idea has been supported, that Citizens who live in neighborhoods where there's a lot of disorderly behavior report being very fearful of being out and about in their community, of being victimized by crimes. Wesley Skogan in 1990 wrote really the the seminal book on this, describing how disorder in communities eventually lead to decline. This second hypothesis, though, is really the one that some people would argue is maybe more important or of more interest to criminologists and policymakers, and that is there an actual disorder serious crime link? Can you show that disorderly behaviors over time do eventually cause crime? And this one is a little bit more controversial. Some people in some studies have said yes, they've proven that disorderly communities over time become the ones with higher crime. But others argue that both of those things, disorder and crime, are just products of other external important factors. And there's also a measurement problem that tends to really exacerbate this, because for the most part, when people measure this, they measure it all at the same time. So they measure if a community not only has disorder, but also has crime. And it's difficult to tell which comes first and what causes what when all of your data is cross-sectional. Some people also say that the context really matters in these experiments, that when you go into these communities that are disorderly, you might not be able to generalize what you find beyond that community. That it might be the case that disorder in one community just looks and feels very different than disorder in another community. When you think about it, some communities might be able to put up with and deal with a higher level of disorder and still be relatively low in crime than other communities. So there are some issues to still kind of parse out in terms of how valid and how much we believe that the link between disorder and crime is very strong.